Welcome back. So most people have heard of the Manson family or Jonestown, but have you ever heard of the Anthill Kids Commune? Doesn't sound very scary, does it? But Canada has cults too. Just outside of the country, not many have heard of this one. I'm not even sure that many Canadians know about this story, to tell you the truth, since it took place back in the 70s and 80s. But before we start, one small disclaimer. Some viewers or listeners of this video may find the graphic details of this story extremely unsettling, to say the least. It involves pretty much every horrible thing you can possibly think of. I don't normally do that, but this story is a doozy, so this is your advanced warning. So Roch Theriault was one of Canada's most terrifying individuals. In 1977, he would begin leading a small group of adoring followers, who were mostly women. Those who knew him described him as charismatic as he was eccentric. He looked like a mountain man, he had a long beard, and wore a robe. He eventually would declare himself to be a messiah. I'm not kidding about that part either. He would eventually change his name to Moses, but I'm getting ahead of myself. We will get to that part later. And the group, under his leadership, would eventually evolve from a wellness group into a doomsday cult that consisted of 8 wives and at least 26 children, most of whom were his. For 12 years, Roch Theriault terrorized his followers with physical, sexual, and psychological torture. And then on August 14, 1989, his reign of terror would come to an end. A woman with a recently and crudely amputated arm was found wandering near the tiny hamlet of Burnt River, Ontario. Her name was Gabrielle Lavallée, and she was a member of the Anthill Kids Commune, a religious cult that was run by the self-proclaimed prophet named Roch Theriault. And she had a story to tell. The group was already being investigated by Children's Aid Society and the police for child abuse and neglect. But up until this point, there really wasn't much that could be done, because members of the group either remained loyal to Roch or absolutely terrified of him. This is the story of Roch Theriault and the Anthill Kids Commune. Previous to Roch Theriault becoming a psychotic, abusive, and sadistic cult leader, his life was pretty boring and quiet. He was born in the Saguenay Valley of Quebec on May 16, 1947, to Hyacinthe and Pierrette Theriault. He was the second born of 7 children and the only boy. At the age of 6, his family would move to Thetford Mines, which was a mining community in southern Quebec that was founded in 1876. After large asbestos deposits were discovered in the area, the town's local school only went up to the 7th grade. So Roch and his brothers and sisters stopped attending school and didn't go any further than that. However, he was an avid reader and even taught himself how to speak English. There was really nothing out of the ordinary in Roch's childhood. It was a normal working-class upbringing. His mother was a laborer and devoutly religious. His father disliked the government and banks and spoke often about his hatred of both of them. His mother was also a member of the Pilgrims of St. Michael, which was a Roman Catholic group that promoted social credit economic theories. The Pilgrims of St. Michael wore white berets as part of their uniform. They attended Mass a lot. They would also hold group meetings, as well as go door to door, handing out literature, trying to recruit more members, similar to the Jehovah's Witness. So basically, the Pilgrims of St. Michael were a weird combination of religion and politics. Over time, his resentment grew, and Roch began to hate both Catholicism and organized religion in general, and turned his back on both, which was ironic considering he would start to see himself eventually as a religious prophet. But other than disagreeing with his family over their religious beliefs, he had a relatively normal childhood, and his teenage years were also pretty uneventful. But later in his adult years, combined with his compulsion to talk a lot, he discovered that complaining about his childhood was a great way to get attention. He told anyone who would listen that his parents were both drunks and that they beat him, and that his earliest memory of being beaten by his father was at the age of 2. And he said that his father also pushed him down the stairs. Both his parents say that these claims of abuse are false and that they never beat their children. His father Hyacinthe, though, did say that he would correct the children if he had to. So that could really mean anything. I'm not really sure who to believe in this case, because Theriault would eventually grow to become a terrifying individual. But he did have 8 siblings, and from everything I've read, they've all grown to live very normal lives. He also claimed that he was conceived from an incestuous relationship, but there's absolutely no proof of that. As I mentioned earlier, he had the gift of the gab. He loved being the center of attention, was charming, apparently, and had a flair for the dramatic. He had the ability to talk non-stop for hours, whether you wanted him to or not, which left people with the impression that he was actually smarter than he was. He was even able to fool psychiatrists during his evaluation after he was arrested. He also had this ability to attract a lot of younger women, similar to Charles Manson. And I cannot for the life of me figure that one out. He must have been a master manipulator because looks-wise he was pretty average. He was described by a psychiatrist as a Renaissance man, with a bright, inquisitive, and sensitive nature. On November 11th, 1967, at the age of 20, he married Francine Grenet, who was 17 years old. The couple moved to Montreal, Quebec, and had 2 children together. Roch Jr. was born in 1969, and Francois was born in 1971. Roch worked as a chimney inspector, and for the first few years of marriage, life was normal, and possibly would have stayed that way. However, we'll never really know. Things were about to change for the family, and not for the better. During 1971, things began to quickly spiral downhill. Roch Sr. developed severe stomach ulcers that caused extreme pain, and required surgery to correct the problem. A portion of his small intestines were removed, but instead of correcting the stomach pain, he developed complications that left him with a condition called dumping syndrome, which isn't pleasant. Many people who've had weight loss surgery have to deal with this condition. Dumping syndrome is a condition where food, especially food high in sugar, moves from your stomach into your small bowel too quickly after you eat. It also comes with a whole bunch of unpleasant symptoms such as diarrhea, nausea, and lightheadedness. The stomach pain made him irritable and cranky, and he was prescribed medication, but quickly felt it wasn't working, so he stopped taking it and began drinking alcohol, heavily. Seeing that alcohol is just fermented sugar, it most likely further aggravated his digestive issues. He ended up quitting his job as a chimney inspector, and the family moved back to Thetford Mines during this time. He started a small woodworking business there and would also become involved in local politics. He joined a group called Le Club Eremi. I'm probably mispronouncing that, but French is not my first language. This was a group that was similar to the Shriners, but his impulse to talk so damn much, combined with his anti-Catholic views, was enough to alienate the other members, who were all Roman Catholic. During this time, he continued to drink excessively, as well as reading medical textbooks, trying to find ways to cure himself of the pain he was in. By 1976, Roch was traveling to Quebec City almost every weekend. He told his wife he was traveling to Quebec City to sell his wood carvings, but in reality, he was actually going there because he was having affairs with multiple women. Giselle was one of the many women he was having an affair with. The two became very close, so much so that he even brought his son Francois to Giselle's house while he was still married to Francine. Eventually, Francine would have enough of his shenanigans and divorced him. Roch was at rock bottom in life. His marriage had fallen apart, his woodworking business had failed miserably, he was unable to pay his mortgage, and his home was eventually repossessed by the bank. At one point, he was living part-time out of the back of his truck, and the other half of the time at Giselle's apartment back in Quebec City. It was around this time that Roch Theriault discovered the Seventh-day Adventist Church and quickly converted to the religion. The Seventh-day Adventist Church recognizes the Saturday as the Sabbath, and they also believe in the second coming of Christ. According to their website, there are 28 fundamental beliefs that can be organized into 6 categories of doctrine: God, man, salvation, the church, daily Christian life, and last day events. Followers believe that a book of judgment will be studied in heaven to see who will be allowed in. As with any religion, there is a spectrum. Some are a little bit more fundamentalist in their belief than others, but that's pretty much the 60-second rundown. If you're a Seventh-day Adventist and I'm not explaining this correctly, please let me know down below. Famous people who you didn't know were Seventh-day Adventists include Prince, Malcolm X, and David Koresh. That last one was obviously a more extreme example of a religious belief gone horribly wrong. Adventists believe in living a healthful life. The healthy, holistic lifestyle of the Seventh-day Adventist Church was appealing to Roch, and he was all in with their approach to health. He quit drinking and smoking and met frequently with a small group of local Adventists who were led by a man named Pierre Zita, who was from the island of Guadeloupe. They met in a local motel every Saturday to listen to Pierre's sermons about the second coming of Christ, and Roch was his most loyal supporter. But something didn't sit right with the other Adventist members. Roch had this ability to make them feel uncomfortable. Around this time, Roch became fascinated with the Old Testament and the Apocalypse, and with the support of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, he opened a homeopathic clinic and began leading his own lectures. These were mainly how to quit smoking seminars, and his audience was primarily young women. And using his charm and charisma, by 1977 he had built his own following. That was very Manson-esque-like. It was mainly teenagers or women in their early 20s. Roch was a big believer in the Old Testament and that men ruled over women. And his followers still stuck around. I can't for the life of me figure that one out. I can only assume it was because these women were young. It was like they were hypnotized or something. Throughout many of these self-help sermons, he would preach that he was a messenger of God, or a doomsday prophet. He was convinced the end of the world was near. The group consisted of Solange Bolliard, age 21, Maurice Lambert, age 18, Chantal Labrie, age 19, Francine Laflamme, age 18, Nicole Ruel, age 20, José Pelletier, age 20, Jacques Fizette, who was in his mid-20s, Claude Willette, who was 24, Jacques Giguère, who was 24, and his wife Maryse Grenier, who was 23, and their 6-month-old baby girl. Maryse was not a true follower of the Adventist Church, or Roch for that matter, but her husband was, so she supported his beliefs. Roch would hold weekly sermons for the group where he would preach about the second coming of Christ in Giselle's apartment. Could you imagine being her neighbor? And Roch would eventually convince all of them to drop out of college. After all, Christ would be returning soon, and there wasn't much point to learning when the end of the world was near. So Roch began to combine his love of reading and talking, and soon began to act as a holistic healer within the community during this time, even though he had absolutely no training in this field. In 1977, Roch and his followers attended an Adventist retreat in Lake Rosso, about 200 kilometers north of Toronto, where he met Yolande Guinbert, who is from France, and Gabrielle Lavallée, who is from Quebec. Both women would end up joining the group. Lake Rosso is a beautiful area of Ontario, and apparently Roch saw it that way too. According to the book Savage Messiah, at one point during the retreat, Roch went hiking by himself and climbed up onto a rocky area. He said he had a vision in which the sun was lit up with a white radiance, and the voice of God told him that the outcropping on which Roch was about to kneel was a holy place. It was also at this moment where Roch decided that the best thing for the group was to move out of the city, after the retreat was over in October of 1977. And after Roch led an unsuccessful bid to lead the local Seventh-day Adventist congregation, Theriault moved his band of devoted followers to Sainte-Marie-de-Beauce, Quebec, about 60 kilometers south of Quebec City. They rented a 2-story house together and opened a healthy living clinic, where they sold organic food and holistic literature. It's also important to remember that he had no medical experience or dietary training. If he was just selling organic food, I wouldn't care so much. But this man was convincing innocent people that he could cure them of their ailments. But we'll get to that in a little bit. Theriault insisted that they all wear a uniform, an ankle-length pullover tunic, green for the women and beige for the men. And Roch wore a dark brown robe, so he stood out as their leader. Overall, the clinic was a success, although he really didn't have a clue what he was doing. It was earning money for the group and bringing in new followers. Some customers also made financial donations or would volunteer their time at the clinic. One man named Léomarc Fauchère sold everything he owned to donate the money to the clinic and moved in with his family. For whatever reason, all of the women in the group were obsessed with Roch, with the exception of Maurice Grenier, who hated being a part of the commune. And this caused Giselle to become very insecure, so she proposed to Roch thinking that it would fix everything. A week later, he agreed, and they were married in an Adventist church in Montreal on January 8, 1978. The wedding was a bit of a shit show. There was absolutely no honeymoon. Giselle spent the 5-hour trip back home quite literally crying on a mattress in the back of the van, while Theriault joked with the other women all the way back home. In March of 1978, a man by the name of Émile Claire, by some unfortunate chance, met Roch Theriault. His wife Geraldine had leukemia and was currently in treatment, and her prognosis at this point looked good. She was responding positively to treatment and probably would have survived had she just been left alone. Roch convinced Émile Claire to let him visit Geraldine in the hospital, where Roch would argue with doctors over Geraldine's treatment. He somehow managed to convince Geraldine to check out of the hospital and instead treat her leukemia at the Healthy Living Clinic with grape juice and organic foods. During this time, Geraldine was isolated from her family, and her own father wasn't allowed to visit her there. And Geraldine Auclair would die at the clinic shortly afterwards. Also during this time, a woman named Gabrielle Nadeau, who was 19 and had multiple sclerosis, was checked into the clinic for Roch's treatment. Her parents had met Theriault at an anti-smoking workshop. When the Adventist church found out about the death of Geraldine, the members weren't happy, to say the least. They became concerned about the welfare of the women devoted to Theriault. Pierre Zita even tried to contact the parents of many of the girls to warn them about Roch. He also tried to convince Giselle to leave Roch, but nothing worked. When family members requested welfare checks, the girls refused to speak with police, and there was nothing that they could charge Roch with. Yet, in April of 1978, just over a year since Roch had joined the Seventh-day Adventist Church, he was voted out of the church permanently. But it doesn't seem like Roch cared very much that he was kicked out. This didn't stop him from preaching to his followers about the end of the world, or instilling his radical beliefs into the minds of his 2 young children, or to marry his followers to each other, even though his followers had no interest in getting married. And Roch didn't exactly have the credentials to perform marriage ceremonies. Claude Ouellet was paired with Solange Bolliard, and Jacques Fizette was paired with Nicole Ruel. Also in spring of that year, Giselle was pregnant and done with the group. So she gave Roch an ultimatum, telling him that the group would have to split up or at least find new homes. Or she would go move back in with her father. Roch's response to this ultimatum was to punch her in the jaw and forbid her from leaving her room for 2 days. In June of 1978, the Healthy Living Clinic was starting to have some money issues. Because it was no longer associated with the Seventh-day Adventist Church, they no longer had food and literature to sell. So it was only a matter of time before it went bankrupt. It also had a mountain of debt, and the group was starting to get some unwanted attention from the police since the death of Geraldine Auclair. So in July of 1978, Roch and his followers abandoned the Healthy Living Clinic. Theriault and the group packed up the van and they wandered from town to town, until they ended up in an isolated area of the Gaspé Peninsula. And it was here that Theriault supposedly had another vision. Theriault told the group that Armageddon was imminent and that the world was going to end on February 17, 1979. There would be boulder-sized hail, earthquakes, and huge lightning storms. And they would become God's chosen people. They would be saved from God's wrath, but only if they lived a righteous life. And Theriault, of course, would be the one to lead the way. He also took his 2 young boys along who he didn't have custody of, and whose mother wasn't aware that he had no intention of returning. The group hiked for 2 days until they found an isolated hill, beside a small body of water. Theriault named the hill Eternal Mountain, and it was here that the group would build a large communal cabin to prepare for the end of the world. He wasn't aware, though, that the lake he chose to build beside dried up by the end of summer. So he started to ration their water consumption. Theriault tortured his followers. Besides limiting their water, he also fed them salt so they wouldn't sweat as much while they were working. He deprived them of sleep, and he rationed their food. And if anyone complained about anything like hunger or dehydration, he would punish them further by restricting their rations. Theriault's stomach pains, he claimed, prevented him from helping to build the cabin. He told his followers that he was going to lead them to spiritual salvation, and convinced them that their family and the outside world were, quote, active oppressors of the righteous. By now, some of the members of the commune had reached their breaking point, and were done with both Roch and the group. Yolande, who had joined the group with her friend Gabrielle Lavallée at the resort at Lake Rosso, went back to France, claiming that her passport had expired. Leo-Marc Fauché, who had joined the Healthy Living Clinic with his wife and child, and who had given Theriault all of their money, decided to cut his losses. After about a month, Roch's sons were starting to show signs of malnourishment. But fortunately, Francine and the police were able to locate the group. It doesn't really go into detail how she was able to find them. It's kind of a miracle, actually, considering they were in the middle of nowhere. The boys were returned to her custody, but they were never really the same after that. At the ages of 8 and 10, they were acting out back at home. Lying and shoplifting, they even accidentally burned down a building while they were playing with matches. Their mother really didn't know what to do. She was kind of at her wit's end, so she told the boys that they had a choice. They could go into foster care, or they could go back and live with their dad. You can pretty much guess which one they chose. In September of 1978, the cabin was finished, although there really wasn't that much to it. It was basically one big open room with a well in the middle, and the rooms were separated by partitions that were only about a meter high, and bed sheets were hung for curtains. This was to be their home until the second coming of Christ. And if things weren't confusing enough in this story, it's about to get a tad bit more confusing. Theriault decided to give all of his followers new names from the Old Testament. He himself took the name Moses, and he wanted his followers to address him as Poppy and Giselle as Mommy. This was also around the time that the group started gaining attention from the local media for their unconventional lifestyle. In October of 1978, Roch declared that all communal marriages, except the one between him and Giselle, were void. This didn't really matter to his followers. All the other arranged marriages that he put together never really took off. However, then Roch began to marry all the women in the group to himself, including Gabrielle Nadeau, the very ill woman with multiple sclerosis. The one exception was Maurice Grenier. She was an outsider who really didn't want much to do with him, and he hated her for that. There are two Maurices in this group, Maurice Grenier, the one who didn't like Roch, and Maurice Lambert. And this is a quote from Marie Lambert when she was asked in a newspaper interview about the marriage to Roch. Quote, "It began during the first fall in Gaspé. It was one marriage ritual after the other over a period of months. He planted the idea using the story of King David and his wives. Some of us had no boyfriends or husbands, and we were out in the woods, so we weren't opposed to this. In the Bible, the harem was very beautiful and good. All the members were isolated from friends and family and the outside world in general. There was no TV or radio or even newspapers to tell them what day of the week it was. Roch forced them to destroy all of their government ID, including their health cards, because he felt it wasn't needed anymore. He would be their leader and their healer. But in reality, he was just tightening his grip on his followers. When the Jonestown Massacre occurred on November 18, 1978, Theriault followed the story closely. But now he had a bigger problem. He had done everything possible to isolate his followers from the outside world. But the mass murder of over 900 people in the jungles of Guyana were giving doomsday cults a lot of attention in the media. And due to this, police began watching the group in November of 1978. But still, there wasn't really anything they could do other than watch. His followers wouldn't speak to outsiders, and Roch hadn't broken any laws, that they knew of anyway. Police wanted to take him into custody, but they lacked evidence that he was a danger to either himself or others. However, Theriault went with them freely and underwent a psychological evaluation. He claimed that he wasn't the leader of the group, that the commune was a democracy, and that they lived in, quote, peace and without promiscuity. He conveniently left out the parts about the food rationing, the abuse, or the polygamous harem. The authorities were on to him, though. They knew he was full of it and that he was abusing his followers, but without any proof, they had to let him go. Theriault had also long ago given up his Adventist diet. He began eating meat and junk food while the rest of the group was borderline starving to death. The group was struggling financially. He even forced Gabrielle to have sex with a local grocer in exchange for food. He also started drinking again after 2 years of sobriety and was a horrible, mean, abusive alcoholic. He began to deliver long, rambling, drunken sermons. And if anyone fell asleep, he'd smack their head with a 4-inch thick club. When Maurice Grenier was pregnant, she ate 2 more pancakes than Theriault had allocated to her. He responded by punching her in the side and breaking 2 of her ribs. A favorite punishment was to make his followers strip naked and to stand in the snow for a few hours. At night, he would play a game of knife throwing, but not just at an empty wall. He would make someone stand there as he tossed knives at them in a drunken stupor. He would force the men to fight each other naked, and he made children hit their own mothers. And no one would dare fight back at him. And I ask myself the obvious question, why did they stay? And there are many reasons for this, most likely. It's really hard to walk away from something that you've spent years emotionally invested in. And his followers believed in everything Roch had to say. They believed in his message, as weird as it may seem in hindsight. But also, they're in the middle of nowhere. He's depriving them of sleep. He's depriving them of food. They didn't have the energy to fight back. Here's an example of a letter Francine wrote to Roch, begging him for forgiveness. Hello, Poppy. I am writing about what you said on the subject of nutrition. It is very true that I nibble, a damnable fault which I will never again repeat. The thought of ingesting such a large quantity of food in so little time discourages me, even if I work outside the entire day without eating. I ask that you forgive me. If it is stealing, I did not realize it. It is this fault which causes my plumpness. I do not want to be a fat, plump servant that is too ugly next to the man that you are. I don't know what to think about everything and the meaning of my actions. I only know that I will not repeat them, and I don't speak lightly. I wish to be a true servant to you, my master, alert, vigorous, with a clear and lively spirit, and well balanced to serve you every moment of my life. I have a long way to go. Thank you, Poppy. Roch's kids weren't exempt from his brutal punishments either, and would be subjected to belt lashes and punches in the face. And if you think these abuses are bad, prepare yourself. It's about to get a whole lot worse. But whenever somebody was punished, they would rationalize the beating by telling themselves that the end of the world was near and that they wouldn't have to suffer for much longer. Except, of course, the world didn't end. February 17th, 1979 came and went, without any second coming of Christ. Lo and behold, Christ did not return that day, and there would be no salvation for his followers. According to Theriault, choosing exact dates from the messages of God is different for him, because, quote, time passes differently for God than for humans on earth. But the group was reassured that the end of the world would be any day now. All group members accepted this reasoning with the exception of Jacques Fizet, who ended up leaving the group in April of 1979. Roch told the group that Jacques had been taken by the devil, and once again they believed him. That is all except Maurice Grenier, who was done and started talking to her husband about leaving the group. She never really wanted to be there anyway, but Roch's behavior was evolving from eccentric religious leader to terrifying, psychopathic, and sadistic. Theriault did not respond to this very well, and instructed Jacques Gregaire, Maurice's husband, to cut off one of Maurice's toes with an axe. Giguère was horrified by this and didn't want to do it. And then Theriault threatened to cut off all her toes with an axe if Giguère didn't do it. So reluctantly, Giguère did as he was told and cut off his wife's baby toe with an axe. After that moment, Giguère ceased to be reluctant. He actually became Roch's main enforcer. Roch got off on torturing and humiliating his followers, all done in the name of God, of course. Examples of this include he would urinate on his followers, or he would make his followers urinate on other members. He would sometimes force them to eat their own feces. He nailed the children to trees by their clothing. He cut off fingers and toes with wire cutters. On one occasion, he made a couple have sex in front of everybody, and then made the man rub feces all over her back. He punched his oldest son in the face when he refused to wrestle his brother. He pulled 11 of Claude's teeth out with a pair of pliers, when there was absolutely nothing wrong with Claude's teeth. He passed a torch over José's back until the skin bubbled. He also passed it over Nicole's stomach the day she gave birth for the first time. He had one of his wives break Claude's legs with a sledgehammer. He methodically sprained Claude's toes. And another time, he used a piece of broken glass to slice Claude's arm open. He ordered his wives to pluck Claude's pubic hair bald. He shot a .22 caliber at Claude. He broke Giselle's ribs with his steel-toed boots. He hit Jacques in the head with a blunt axe and broke Jacques' ribs with a wooden club. He stuck a hypodermic needle in Gabrielle's back with an unknown mixture inside and twisted it so the tip broke off underneath her skin. He hog-tied Claude and suspended him from the ceiling for an hour. He poured boiling water over Claude. And another time he made Claude sit down on a lit stove. He beat Nicole, who was 3 months pregnant, causing her to miscarry. He threw a knife at Francine and Maurice. And he punched Solange in the neck, knocking her out. He had Jacques pound Gabrielle's thigh with a sledgehammer. He had Jacques cut off half of Gabrielle's left baby finger with a pair of wire cutters. He whipped Gabrielle in the eye with a belt. He burned Gabrielle's breasts and genitals with a torch. He broke Gabrielle's finger with a board. And he made her cut a hole in the ice of a pond and jump in the freezing water. He broke Solange's cheekbone when she was 6 months pregnant. At one point, Gabrielle's uterus was prolapsed about 3 inches outside of her vagina. But instead of taking her to the hospital, Roch decided to fix it himself by punching her uterus back inside her body and used a wooden cone to plug her back up. Gabrielle would end up running away to a women's shelter, but she returned to the group instead of seeing a doctor. Roch's next treatment was to tie a piece of string around her uterus and yank at it as if it was a loose tooth. Gabrielle would have to wait a whole year before she was able to get a partial hysterectomy. And she was only able to do this because Roch happened to be away in Utah. In April of 1979, Chantal Labre's parents obtained a court order for psychiatric tests for their daughter. When 2 police officers showed up at the compound, however, Theriault wouldn't let them in, or release Chantal to her parents. 4 days later, however, a Quebec newspaper published a story on the group entitled, "They are happy and free to leave if they wish." In the article, Theriault is called the group's spiritual father, and even had quotes from former member Jacques Fizet, the member who left, where he said although he left, he supports Roch, and that the group was a democracy. But law enforcement didn't care. A group of 10 police officers and a helicopter raided Eternal Mountain. Theriault was arrested and charged with obstruction of justice, and he was ordered by the court to undergo a psychological evaluation at Quebec City's Robert Gifford Hospital. The family of other cult members took this moment to intervene and tried to convince their loved ones to leave Roch, but none took the opportunity. They stayed with the group. Roch not only aced his psychological evaluation, but Theriault managed to brainwash his own doctors. He told them that he saved these kids from drug addiction and he was leading them on the right path. Even the director of the hospital where Theriault was staying began referring to his patient as Moses. This is the level of craziness we've reached. The director was actually angry that Roch was sent for evaluation because of his unconventional lifestyle. Roch would be released from the hospital early and considered fit to stand trial for obstruction of justice. He would eventually be given a 1-year suspended sentence. The media fell for his manipulation too, and he was portrayed as a slightly eccentric guru, living off the grid who was purposely being targeted. This was just more proof to his adoring followers that he was a messenger of God, just like he said he was. In April of 1979, Theriault returned to the commune. Chantal Labrie, who the psychologist found to be in good mental health, also returned. In October of 1979, Gabrielle Lavallée, the multiple sclerosis patient, died despite Theriault's spiritual healing treatments. In early November of 1980, a man named Guy Vere showed up to the commune after wandering off from a Quebec City mental institution, where he was being treated for depression. He had heard about Theriault and the commune on television. Vere would be permitted to stay at the commune, but he wouldn't be allowed to live in the main house. Instead, he would sleep in a storage shed with chickens, away from Theriault and his family. He would be given a small wood stove, a case of beer, and 1 meal a day. He was given jobs like everyone else, but his main job would be chopping wood. A mentally ill patient with an axe. What could possibly go wrong? He was also in charge of storing the food rations in the winter and babysitting the 3 children that didn't belong to Theriault. They were Samuel Greger, age 2, Miriam Greger, age 4, and Simon Ouellet, age 2, who was the son of Solange and Claude during their brief marriage. On March 23, 1981, Theriault had organized a party, and Vere, of course, was not invited. His job was to babysit the 3 outsider children. There are 2 versions regarding what happened the night of the party. The first version was the testimony given in court by Theriault, Guy Vere, and most of the cult members. Apparently, the little boy was crying that night and keeping Vere awake. Vere lost his temper and started screaming at the child to be quiet. Then he grabbed the 2-year-old by the throat and punched Samuel in the face 5 or 6 times. Theriault found out what Vere had done the next day, and Samuel will be looked after by Gabrielle, who took on the role of nurse for the group. Allegedly, the baby's head was flopping around on his neck, and for whatever reason, Roch decided that the child needed to be circumcised, using a pair of scissors that were sterilized by rubbing alcohol. The next morning, Samuel was found dead. This is the version that is found in court records. According to the book Savage Messiah by Paul Kalya, Giselle claimed that Samuel's face was bruised on the morning of March 24th, but that there was nothing else wrong with him. However, Theriault still decided that the child needed to be circumcised. Using an ethanol solution to sterilize the razor, he also gave some to the child orally for use as an anesthetic. According to the book Savage Messiah, Samuel died from alcohol poisoning. And after hearing about her baby's death, Maryse Grenier had no emotion. She apparently just went back to work. She most likely knew that if she reacted, she would be brutally punished. 6 months after the death of Samuel, a drunken Roch became angry with Vere for something completely unrelated and decided that the group should hold a mock trial for his crimes of the previous March. Each member was assigned a role. He appointed Jacques Greger, the baby's father, to be the judge. Giselle would be the prosecution. Claude would be the lawyer for the defense. Gabrielle would act as the coroner. And Roch's 6 other wives would act as the jury. The trial would last for 1 hour, and the jury was unanimous, not guilty by reason of insanity. But Roch was not happy with the jury's verdict, and decided that Vere should be castrated. Theriault then called for another vote. 7 out of the 10 voted in favor for this punishment. Vere obviously was not in favor of this idea, but strangely enough, Theriault was actually able to talk him into it, saying that it would cure Vere's headaches as well as his excessive masturbation issues. He asked Vere to write a letter of consent and said that he wouldn't make Vere sign it if he didn't want to sign it, but Vere signed it. And Vere was held down on the kitchen table as Gabrielle fetched the medical instruments for Roch: an elastic band, a razor blade, a pair of tweezers, and ethanol. The operation was quick, and the testicles were thrown away in a wrapped piece of Kleenex. I have no idea how this man didn't bleed to death, but somehow he survived, and he never complained about another headache ever again. The trial and sentence wasn't enough for Roch, who now saw Veer as a security risk and enjoyed tormenting him. But on November 5th, 1981, Veer managed to escape into the village of St. Joe's. He told the locals about the death of Samuel. However, he changed the facts and said that the baby had died after being kicked by a horse. Shortly afterwards, the commune was raided by police. Roch and Samuel's parents were arrested, and Child Protective Services was contacted. All 14 children were taken into custody and placed in foster homes. The police found the baby's remains and were told the story of Veer beating the child. They even showed the police Veer's letter of consent. What puzzled police was how calm everybody was. No one in the group seemed upset or even embarrassed by what happened. Roch Theriault, Jacques Reguer, Maurice Grenet, Gabrielle Lavallée were all charged with criminal negligence causing bodily harm. Claude Ouellet, who cremated the baby's body, was charged with obstruction of justice. Jacques and Maurice were also charged with neglect towards their oldest daughter, who was now 5. Claude and Solange Bolliard were similarly charged for their treatment of Simon Ouellet, now 3 years old. Theriault and Lavallée were also charged with bodily harm with the intent to mutilate Guy Veer, and all of the accused pleaded not guilty. Jacques, Maurice, Claude, Solange, and Guy were all released, but one of the conditions of their release was they were not allowed to return to the cabin, and Theriault and Lavallée would be denied bail. In the end, though, everyone on trial would be found guilty of all charges. Jacques Reguer and Claude Ouellet received 6 months in prison and 3 years probation for child abandonment. Maurice and Solange received 3 years probation. Guy Veer was sentenced, but later acquitted for mental incompetence, and he was returned to the psychiatric ward at Robert Gifford Hospital. Gabrielle Lavallée was sentenced to 9 months in jail and 3 years probation. Roch Theriault was sentenced to 2 years less a day in prison and 3 years probation to be served concurrently. One would think that this would be the end of the hellish nightmare, and the group would disperse and move on with their lives. Not a chance, not even close. Things were just getting warmed up. The commune members were loyal to Theriault, so they stayed together. They moved to Quebec City to be closer to Roch while he was behind bars serving his sentence. The cabin on the Gaspé had been destroyed by the police and bulldozed to the ground. Roch would be allowed conjugal visits during his sentence and somehow managed to impregnate 4 of his wives during his 18-month prison sentence. Fortunately, though, they were being watched by police and CPS, and the children were quickly taken into custody after they were born. When Roch Theriault was released from prison in February of 1984, his followers wanted to stay together in the city, but Moses had other plans. Of course he wouldn't want to stay in the city. There's too many people around. There's no way to isolate his followers there. Too many people around and too many cops. They would go back into the wilderness and start over again, but this time just outside the tiny village of Burnt River, Ontario. All of his followers spoke French, so right away they were isolated. Even if they could possibly get away, none of them could communicate, and Roch was the only one who spoke English. He did the typical domestic violence abuser thing. He told them all he had quit drinking and promised them that there would be no more violence, and they believed him. And in May of 1984, the group began to build a new cabin. Burnt River is a tiny community in the Kawartha region and part of Victoria County, home to about 250 people. It has 2 churches, a post office, a community center, and a fire station. Together, his followers built a cabin, a 2-story house with a kitchen, a bakery, a maple sugar shack, a smokehouse, a root cellar, a greenhouse, and a stone altar which Roch used to connect with God. Theriault also designed a do-it-yourself sawmill, using a chainsaw, a snowmobile engine, and bicycle parts. Quite the little MacGyver, isn't he? Their new commune was nothing like the old one on Eternal Mountain, which was crude to put it mildly. What they built this time was impressive, although I have no idea how they were able to do it. Their new home was built entirely by only 2 males and 9 females, 4 of whom were pregnant. Theriault's sons were now 15 and 17 years old, and had not seen their father since the day the old commune was raided by police and CPS. Their life, away from their father's rage, had dramatically improved. They were doing well in school, they had friends, but they still had issues getting into trouble. So they reached out to their father. They told their mother that they wanted to give their father a chance, and that they thought this time was going to be different because Roch had stopped drinking. And this was true, for a very brief time. But before long, Roch was back to his old habits, drinking non-stop and playing mind games. Roch established a new hierarchy for the group, assigning each of his wives different responsibilities. At the bottom of the group was Maurice Grenier. Theriault forbid Jacques and Maurice from sleeping together, and encouraged Jacques to beat her regularly, even though she was pregnant. He eventually ordered Maurice to live apart from everyone else in her own hut, with her 2 children. Apparently he thought a birthmark that she had looked like 666, and apparently nobody who visited the compound had any idea what was going on. They were also unaware of the group's criminal record back in Quebec. They were seen as eccentric but hardworking neighbors who enjoyed living off the land. I guess while the group was in Quebec, each individual member qualified for welfare. But in Ontario, the group wasn't quite so lucky. So to help the group survive, Roch ordered the members to start stealing. They even made these special jackets with huge inner pockets so they could steal more stuff. Roch also encouraged his followers to call their parents and ask them for money, telling them that if their parents refused, that only meant that everything Roch had said about them was true. Strangely enough, though, his followers were so indoctrinated they actually begged Roch not to call their parents, because they already knew what their parents would say. They were more than willing to help and give the girls money, but only if they left Roch. This, of course, didn't happen. The group started a small business selling fruit and baked goods, which was actually successful. They were still surviving off of potatoes and corn mostly, but at least they were making some money. Roch would nickname them the Anthill Kids, because they worked together like a nest of ants. But as things continued to improve, Theriault seemed to be getting bored with life as it were, and continued to drink excessively, which only made him more terrifying to be around. And his followers never knew which side of him they would see. He would play his wives off against each other, he would force women to wrestle naked, sometimes he would beat or whip his followers, sometimes he would strike them with the side of an axe or with the side of a hammer, and no matter how badly they were injured, they were forbidden from going to a hospital for treatment. During one of his rages, he slashed Jacques Reguer's jugular with a broken wine glass, and he also ordered Jacques to be circumcised. I'm going to read a letter from Solange that she wrote to Roch. It sort of explains why the group stayed together. They felt that God was using Theriault as a vessel to punish them. So it was really God that was abusing them and beating them up, not Roch. I know it sounds weird, but that's how messed up in the head and brainwashed these people were. And because Roch loved being the center of attention and had a flair for the dramatic, he would always weep for days after one of his violent rages, and after he started to sober up. On January 26, 1985, Gabrielle Lavallée's baby son died of exposure to the cold. At 9 a.m., Gabrielle put her 5-month-old son, named Eliezer, in a wheelbarrow. It was freezing outside. It was snowing, and the temperature was -10. By 10:45 a.m., the baby was dead. It's not exactly clear why she did this. Roch apparently hated the baby and said it bore the mark of the devil. Gabrielle later said that she thought this was an act of mercy, to spare the child from a life of Theriault's beatings. Or she could have left. That perhaps would have been a better decision. or at least surrender the child to Child Protective Services. Anything would have been better than the choice she made. Al Lackey, who was a friend of Theriault's, and the local coroner, claimed that sudden infant death syndrome was the real cause of death. However, the Children's Aid Society was getting suspicious and began watching the commune like a hawk. A child had managed to escape from the commune earlier and had signs of physical and sexual abuse. Bob Galapo was the first Children's Aid Society officer to inspect the group during the summer of 1984. Upon first inspection, including the nurse checking the children over, all seemed to be well. But despite what they saw, Bob Galapo said that something didn't feel right, and Children's Aid Society started digging into the group's past in Quebec and keeping an eye on them at the same time. It took about a year for Children's Aid Society to gather enough evidence that proved the children needed to be removed from the property. However, for the time being, the children stayed on the compound. In October of 1985, after a year of being forbidden to have relations with her pre-cult husband Jacques, Maurice Grenier, the only woman of the group Theriault hadn't married, was allowed to leave with 2 of her 3 surviving children, a 2-year-old and an infant. However, Roch forced Maurice to leave her oldest daughter behind, hinting that he wanted to take her daughter as another wife. Maurice agreed to this arrangement, but after being on her own for 8 months and gaining some independence away from the insanity she had been a part of for 8 years, she realized that leaving her daughter behind with a madman was not the best choice, and pursued legal action to get custody of her child. Part of this legal action involved Maurice working with Children's Aid Society and testifying about the conditions of the community. It didn't take long before Children's Aid Society raided the property and 9 children were placed in foster homes. The women apparently had the choice of leaving Roch and being able to keep their children, but they chose to stay, so their children were taken away. In their new homes, however, the children showed signs of being horrifically abused. While living on the compound, Roch had separated the children into 2 groups: his own, who he considered the chosen children, and those who were not his own. And because he despised Maurice Grenier, her children had been neglected. They crawled like animals and were severely malnourished, and both the adults and the other children were not allowed to speak to them. Some children had mouths full of rotting teeth. Some would randomly scream, rock, chant, or bang on things. And the children had chores around the commune, such as hand-washing the adult women's sanitary napkins. They were deprived of sleep, of food, and hygiene. I could go on, but some of the things that happened to the kids were just too horrific to repeat. The court ordered an independent evaluation of the children that included Dr. Raoul Huneau and Dr. Martin Milikovic. Both recommended that the children be returned to Burnt River immediately. Their report was 300 pages long, and in it they praised Theriault's pioneering spirit and experimental attitude regarding sexual education. The 2 doctors accused the government of trying to split up the group and withholding welfare. Those 2 doctors should have had their licenses revoked. Children's Aid Society also released its own report, and for some reason, Theriault already seemed to know the details of it. Roch was up to his old tricks, manipulation, and using his charm to get what he wants. Fortunately, though, the court saw through the BS. On October 26, 1987, the court ruled that 9 children be made wards of the court, and that the parents were stripped of their parental rights. The court believed, quote, Theriault to be a manipulative despot who posed a significant risk of molestation and exploitation. The ruling was 83 pages long, and it also suggested that the 2 doctors' testimony and the testimony of the Children's Aid Society agent were biased, because the doctors were Francophone or French-speaking, and their professional opinion was, quote, were mostly the result of a cultural prejudice of sympathy for any French-speaking community in a mostly English setting, and that the doctors were not being objective when it came to the children's safety. However, there still wasn't enough evidence to press criminal charges against Theriault. Even Maurice Grenier was not willing to testify against Roch as she was still afraid. One night, in one of his drunken rages, he ordered Claude Ouellet to wrap an elastic band around his scrotum, tightly. He was forced to keep it on overnight, which caused infection to set in and later gangrene. Claude, of course, wasn't allowed to go to the hospital, and Theriault was only too happy for the opportunity to play doctor again and operate. Claude was forced to drink alcohol to knock him out, and Roch used a razor blade to perform his operation, cutting open Claude's scrotum and pulling out the infected testicle with his fingers. The wound was then cauterized with a hot piece of iron. It was around this time that Roch's sons walked in the room as Roch was displaying Claude's amputated testicle proudly in his hands. He then told his son to take the testicle to his shed, where he kept all the amputated toes and fingers of his followers in jars. The story just keeps getting worse and worse. My jaw dropped when I read this. The abuse was horrifying enough, but he had a trophy shed of severed body parts. Needless to say, his sons didn't stick around, and they never saw their father again after this. They then held a vote to determine whether Claude should be stoned to death for offending God. The group voted against this, and then Roch grabbed a welder's torch and threatened to open Claude's stomach. Claude managed to escape into the woods that night, where he hid until Theriault sobered up. Hiding in the woods became a habit for most of the group's members, especially for Giselle, Gabrielle, and Claude. Giselle would sometimes run away to her father's house for days, until Roch would call her and beg her to come back to her real family. He would be kind for a few days, but eventually she would be beaten for running away and disobeying him. In February of 1987, Roch threw a hunting knife at Giselle, leaving her with a wound that was about 3 inches deep. Her leg started to gush blood, and his response was to drink more booze and to go to sleep. Several hours later, when he woke up, a clot had formed in Giselle's leg, which had swollen. Roch decided to perform one of his crude operations, pressing the leg to cause the wound to reopen, examining it with a red-hot iron, and pouring boiling water over her leg. A week later, the wound was infected. Roch decided to fill the wound with salt, olive oil, and spruce gum. After her leg had healed a bit, she tried to escape again. But a few days later, she went back to Roch. Earlier, I mentioned a letter from Solange to Roch, and it offers a bit of an explanation as to why they stayed, or at least why she stayed. What they put up with was far more than abuse. It was sadistic and evil. The letter read, "Good day, Moses, my master. I would have liked to talk to you yesterday evening, but I think it's preferable to write these things down rather than saying them for fear of talking too much. I'm going to talk to you about the last fit of anger that your master exercised through you. I really believe that what you did doesn't come from you, but someone much higher. For my part, I really believe you were possessed by a very powerful spirit. That's what I saw in what you did. The throwing of the knife, the rifle shot. My eyes saw things that went beyond them. My body is very afraid of all these things. I understand it very well because the law of death in which it exists. But within myself I am well. I am very well and happy to belong to a real master, who himself belongs to the only real master of life." In September of 1988, Solange complained of stomach pain, and Theriault convinced her that there was something wrong with her liver and that he needed to operate. He got ridiculously drunk and then converted their bakery into a makeshift operating room. He first gave Solange an enema that was a mixture of molasses, oil, and water. He started pressing and punching Solange in the stomach, and after that he put a tube in her throat and ordered everyone to start blowing and sucking on the tube. And then using a kitchen knife, he made a 5-inch vertical incision on her stomach, and then reached in without any gloves on and ripped off about 4 inches of her intestine. Solange was quiet, she didn't cry out, she didn't make any noise. Gabrielle sewed up her wound, and Solange got up off the table. Everyone went back to the cabin, and then Roch made Solange take a warm bath, which made her feel worse. And then he made her take a cold bath, What she really needed more than anything was a hospital. Solange died later on that night. The cause of death was listed as acute peritonitis, inflammation caused by digestive fluids leaking into the abdomen. Roch was hysterical after Solange's death and tried to kill himself, unsuccessfully of course. First he tried to get Jacques to shoot him, then he tried to OD on extra-strength Tylenol, and then finally he tried to drown himself. But this is where things get a little weird, to say the least, and I know that sounds insane after everything I've just told you, but Solange's death seemed to force Roch to lose the small amount of sanity he had left. Theriault was apparently having strange dreams about Solange. Dreams where Solange was inside of Roch's body. But to go further than that, Solange was inside of Theriault's semen, and he had the power to reverse birth her and resurrect her back to Earth. In other words, Roch became convinced that he was pregnant with his dead wife Solange. He ordered Claude to exhume Solange's body, and he forced Jacques to drill a hole in Solange's skull with a hand drill. He then masturbated into the hole, convinced that he would be able to bring her back to life. It's possible that Giselle felt that Roch would keep abusing Solange's body, because Giselle told Theriault that Solange had said she wanted to be cremated. Roch finally would agree to this, but not before he removed one of Solange's ribs and turned it into a necklace. After the cremation, he took the fragments of bone and put them into a jar with olive oil. And Roch would regularly masturbate into this jar, convinced he would be able to resurrect Solange back to life. It only took 12 years, but things were finally starting to fall apart. However, Roch was able to hide from Children's Aid Society that 2 of his wives had given birth. He was also able to hide the details of Solange's death from her family and police. José Pelletier left Roch for good in the winter of 1988. On July 26, 1989, Roch became drunk, but his followers were starting to gain some courage and knew not to stick around and become a target of his rage. On this date, Giselle, Claude, Francine, and Maurice all managed to sneak away into the bush and hide. Gabrielle, however, unfortunately did not. Theriault remembered that Gabrielle had a stiff pinky finger and told her to put her hand out on the kitchen table. But Roch had other intentions. He stabbed her hand with a hunting knife, pinning it to the table. She was in complete agony, but forced herself to remain conscious. After 45 minutes, Roch came back over to see that Gabrielle's whole arm had turned blue. Quote, "It's not looking so good, is it?" he said. He started taking chunks of flesh out of her arm between the elbow and the shoulder. Roch then removed the hunting knife that was pinning Gabrielle's arm to the table. He took her over to a tree stump that was sticking out of the kitchen floor, and then he amputated Gabrielle Lavallée's arm off completely with a dull meat cleaver. Gabrielle had somehow made it through this entire ordeal without screaming once. That is some serious pain tolerance. The next day she escaped to a women's shelter, but returned shortly afterwards. A couple of days later, Theriault decided that Gabrielle's stump had gangrene and used a pair of scissors to cut out the infection. He also smacked her in the head with the side of an axe and cut a chunk of flesh out from her breast. And then she escaped into the bush, where she stayed for 2 days, after which she had discovered that insects had laid eggs in her wounds. Gabrielle escaped from the commune on August 16, 1989. She made it to a hospital, but had some trouble explaining her missing arm. Police were called, and charges of aggravated assault against Roch Theriault were filed. But when the police arrived to the compound on August 19th with a warrant for Theriault's arrest, there was nobody there. Everyone had left, and the hunt for Roch Theriault began. The remaining members had finally gone back to their parents. Better late than never, I suppose. The only exceptions were Jacques Grégaire, Chantal Labrie, and Nicole Ruel, along with their 2 youngest children, who Children's Aid Society were completely unaware of. They apparently all took off with Roch and were heading towards Quebec. And Roch would be on the run for about 6 weeks before he was arrested. He and his small band of loyalists were caught trying to sneak into the U.S. But fortunately, he was caught and arrested. Everyone who was involved in Gabrielle's arm amputation would plead guilty to the charges against them. Roch was sentenced to 12 years in prison. Jacques was sentenced to 5 years, Chantal was sentenced to 2 years less 1 day, and Nicole was sentenced to 18 months. Roch also faced additional charges for first-degree murder for the death of Solange. But this would later be reduced to second-degree murder because the Crown said it would be difficult to prove that her murder was premeditated. Rather than going through a time-consuming trial, Theriault's lawyer made a deal with the Crown, where Roch would plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for no further charges being brought against him. And on January 18, 1993, Roch Theriault was sentenced to life in prison. He would be eligible for parole after serving 15 years. And throughout his incarceration, he still had frequent visits from 3 of his wives. Apparently, they got a place just down the road from the prison. Francine, Chantal, and Nicole remained devoted to Roch. According to Maclean's magazine, around 1994, Theriault was still fathering children from prison. On May 21st, 35-year-old Francine Laflamme gave birth to her 6th child by Theriault, in the house where she lived with the 3 other women. The 3 women also ran a bakery together in Kingston. And another follower, 37-year-old Nicole Ruel, was also pregnant, even though prison rules stated that Theriault was only entitled to conjugal visits with only one partner. It's hard to say how many kids this guy actually has. Some sources say 26, but I've seen some say that the numbers could be around 28. But his many children ended up scattered in foster homes across the continent. On July 11, 2002, Roch Theriault applied and was denied day parole, as the parole board felt he was still a danger to society. When questioned by the media, Gabrielle Lavallée, who had her right arm hacked off by Theriault, said he deserves to stay in jail forever. Quote, "The population, including myself, will be able to have a long night's sleep tonight. Sitting behind him at the hearing brought back all the memories of the time when I weighed 80 pounds and had to help authorities catch him." In June of 2002, the Movie Network released the movie Savage Messiah, a film based on the story of Gabrielle Lavallée's relationship with a sadistic killer. She also dealt with her trauma by writing a book and touring schools in Quebec, speaking to children about the dangers of cults that prey on the weak and vulnerable. Her memoir of her life in the cult is entitled Alliance of the Sheep. In 2008, Corrections Canada was ordered to look into Roch Theriault's financial situation. Apparently, he had been auctioning off his paintings, handprints, and poems on a site called murderauction.com. Minimum bids on his artwork reached as high as $500. In 2009, Corrections Canada put their foot down and, quote, imposed restrictions of the decimation of artwork and hobbycraft items, as well as written materials such as memoirs, bibliographies, or public communications. However, according to an Access of Information request, this policy only seemed to apply to Roch Theriault and not all offenders. Theriault would remain in prison until February 11, 2011, when a prisoner named Matthew Gerard MacDonald, age 60, decided to take matters into his own hands. MacDonald was serving time for a second-degree murder conviction and was due to be released in 3 years. However, MacDonald despised Theriault for how he treated women in the past. MacDonald was seen on prison video entering Theriault's cell, which then showed the 2 men struggling. He jumped on Theriault and stabbed him in the neck with a homemade shank. Theriault bled to death on the floor and was nearly decapitated. Immediately after, MacDonald then calmly walked over to a pair of guards, handed them the shank covered in blood, and said, quote, "That piece of shit is down on the range. Here's the knife, I've sliced him up." In 2012, Matthew Gerard MacDonald would plead guilty to first-degree murder. He confessed in court that the murder wasn't premeditated, but he did intend to kill Theriault. So there's a sensible, logical side of me that says murder under any circumstances is wrong. However, because Theriault was the devil reincarnated, I'm not one who believes in karma, but this just seems like poetic justice. there's a small part of me that is secretly cheering this man Matthew on. Which brings me to the end of the story of Roch Theriault. What a terrible story. In some ways, it reads like a movie script from beginning to end. Every frightening thing you could possibly think of happened. I'm going to go and hug my cat and decompress from this one. And here's some random clips of her to help you wind down. As always, let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Thank you so much for taking the time to hang out with me, and I will see you next time.